Welcome to our paranormal afterlife. This is our paranormal afterlife, and I'm your host Simon Bowen. And you can enjoy the extended version of this episode ad-free, along with over 100 hours of extended episodes on Patreon. This week I'm talking to Matt McKay about his book, Lessons from the Afterlife. Matthew McKay, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at the Wright Institute. He has authored and co-authored over 40 books. After Matthew's son died, he learned how to communicate with him in the afterlife. Hi Matt, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Glad to be with you, Simon.
So we're going to talk about your book, Lessons from the Afterlife. Guidance in this book comes from your son, Jordan. So could you tell us about Jordan?
My son, Jordan, has been gone from the physical universe for more than 16 years. He was murdered on the streets of San Francisco. And as I think any parent who loses a child feels, I wanted desperately to know whether Jordan still exists, whether that soul I knew as Jordan still exists, and is he okay wherever he is. So those are things that just were so deeply, such a deep need I experienced with him after his death. And so I set out to try to find him in various ways. I consulted mediums. I talked to, Felix Lerma and Austin Wells. And I had some experiences that were meaningful to me. The mediums were describing what they heard him saying, but it wasn't a conversation. I couldn't really be part of it. I couldn't really ask questions and find out more about where he was and what it was like. I consulted Alan Botkin, who developed or discovered something called induced after-death communication, IADC, which uses a variant of EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a trauma treatment that I use with clients. But he discovered another way of using it, another protocol that allowed many of his clients to actually hear or see the person that they had lost. And so I consulted with him, and I did have an after-death experience with Jordan. I heard him very clearly saying things to me. It was his voice. It felt like very much it was outside of my own head. And he was telling me the things that I wanted to know, that, he was was he was good. He still loved us. He was with us in some ways. He's in a good place. And it was very healing in some way, yet I still had the experience of not being able to talk to him and have a conversation, which I just deeply needed to somehow reach a point where we could talk back and forth. And I did some other things. I did, past life and life between life hypnosis, hypnotic regressions. I had some experiences through that. But finally, I consulted the late Ralph Metzner, who was kind of a specialist in after-death communication, and he taught me how to channel. And from the first night after I met him and he taught me how to channel, I had the experience that I could talk to Jordan. I could have those conversations. And for for around 16 years now, I've been having conversations with Jordan, hundreds of them, that have been incredibly meaningful. And once he started to talk to me, he really began to answer my deepest questions. He kind of blew my mind. He gave me a picture of the afterlife. He talked about our purpose in coming to Earth. And he was telling me things that I could never really have imagined. And out of all of that came some of the Jordan books, Seeking Jordan, where it talks a lot about finding him and what he describes about the afterlife, and then the luminous landscape of the afterlife, where he really describes the spirit world in detail, what it is and looks like, and what to expect there, and also how to prepare for our transition to death. he had a lot to say about love and how to achieve it, how to find it, how to become love. And that became a book called Love in the Time of Impermanence. And now finally, Lessons from the Afterlife is really about this place. What is this place where we are here on this planet, and why do we come here? So those are some of the things all of these years that he's been talking about and revealing. And I have just essentially been a scribe and written down what he had to say and passing it on to people who are interested.
So when you communicate with him, is it that you hear his voice? It's kind of like normal hearing, or is it something in your mind?
No, it's creating a sense of receptivity as a process, a meditation process that I use to kind of open the channel, which if you want to talk about, I'm glad to describe. It's not very complicated or hard to do. Anyone can do it. I don't have any clairaudient or psychic abilities, really, but I do have the ability to hear him. I hear him inside my mind. I don't hear him talking outside. He's inside my mind, but he's saying unique things, and he's saying in the way that he's communicating as Jordan communicates, not as I communicate. So his distinct personality is incredibly present and very different from mine. And he's saying things that I've never prepared to hear before. He's explaining things that I've never understood, or providing me a picture of, say, the afterlife that I have no knowledge of and never occurred to me. What he's describing. So it's unique. It's in his language, and his personality and so forth are really present. And that's how I know it's him.
And do you feel anyone could do this? I mean, how do you open the channel?
Yeah, I've taught hundreds of people how to channel, and over the years, I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist. Over the years, I've had lots of clients who've had profound loss, and many of them I've taught to channel, and they have it changes their experience of death and loss, because they realize that soul is still with them, that love is still very much alive and very active, and death does not change that, has no dominion over our relationships or over the love between us. So yes, it's something that most people can learn to do.
And is it like going into a really deep meditation?
Yes. There are different ways to open the channel, but the one I use and typically teach others is, first of all, just get into a comfortable, safe place. Get an object that connects you to the person who is on the other side. It could be something they gave you. It could be something that they had or owned. But it's often helpful to have an object that provides a sense of connection in a physical world. And then you need something for eye fixation. Candles work great. Just watching the flame. And while engaging in eye fixation, just a simple Vipassana breath-based meditation is usually very, very effective. So thinking about the person you love, intending to open the channel, being aware of your love and care for them, and then doing the meditation. So the meditation is very simple. Just bring your attention to your breath, to the diaphragm. You can, on each out-breath, count. And the first out-breath is 1, and the second is 2, and 3, and 4, up to 10. Then you can start repeating back to 1 again. So you're noting, you're attending to the breath. You're noting each in-breath or each out-breath. And then when thoughts arise, you gently bring your attention back from the thought to the breath and to noting the out-breath. Very simple. And, thoughts do show up, but it slows the mind, and it allows you to enter a contemplative space that begins to open the channel. Then Ralph taught me to, once you feel receptive, your mind begins to quiet. You're entering, and you really are entering an alternate space when you're meditating. Then you visualize a orb just above your head, the color of the sun. And usually when I visualize that, I can feel something changing in my scalp. I really literally feel the channel opening on a physical level. And then visualize that orb shifting into a tube-like bright structure that stretches all the way to the loved one in the spirit world. And at that point, I encourage people to, with a notepad, literally to write down their question for their loved one. Writing is a very important part of this. Physically writing the question is part of opening the channel, and it really is a part of building a meditative process. And then you wait. You wait for the very first thing that shows up in your mind and write that down. It could be just one word. And then wait a little longer. Wait for the next thing to show up. And it's very important, whatever shows up, write it down. Even if it doesn't make any sense, just write it down and wait. Something else will show up. Wait, something else will show up. And communications from the other side come in different ways. Sometimes they come as like a big download, just huge amount of understanding and meaning that you later have to find words to describe the download. I mean, Jordan once downloaded a whole therapy process in the space of, 10 seconds that I later had to go back and attach words to the process and even there were even images associated with the process, and I had to build those out as well. But sometimes it shows up as a kind of machine gun, very rapid torrent of words that you can hardly keep up with as you're writing. Sometimes it shows up as just really brief, one or two or three words, and it's very concentrated meanings and communications. So it can show up. Sometimes it shows up as an image, as a picture, So I guess I want to encourage people to allow the communication to come in whatever form, whatever way it comes, but to write down the answer. Use your notebook to write both your question and your answer. And over time, you have you may have a record of a very significant communications and the ongoing relationship with your loved one on the other side. You can ask anything you want. The only thing the spirits are very reluctant to do is tell us anything about the future, because it takes away our free will. But they're happy to give us advice. Jordan's given me a tremendous amount of counseling and advice and guidance over the years. So they can give you guidance. They can tell you, more about what the afterlife is like. They can tell you sometimes very much a lot about your purpose in coming here. Why did you come for this particular life? What were you planning to learn? What was the lesson plan for this life? Why are you experiencing certain hardships and certain kinds of pain? Our loved ones on the other side often know quite a bit about that. So there are lots of things you can ask. And I've had the privilege of asking Jordan, and he has been willing to share with me incredible answers that I could never have dreamed of.
And have you communicated with others?
A little bit with my father, and I have very little bit with my mom. But most of the channeling I've done has been with Jordan, because I think it's because I know him so well that it's easier to open the channel with him than with others. And his way of communicating is so familiar, even though the things he says are surprising and I've never thought of before. his way of communicating is familiar, and it feels safe in some way to me to talk to him.
When he describes the afterlife, is there stuff that he describes that just seems completely beyond us, that almost maybe surprised you, or you think, I just can't quite understand that?
Well, yes. I mean, the answer to that is yes. I mean, he has said so many things that really, really surprised me. But I mean, I think some of what has surprised me most has been how he describes what we would call the divine or all or God. Very different. I grew up, as a kid in the Catholic Church, and boy, is what he presents the divine to look like and to be is so different from what I learned, and surprisingly different. And so I think that has been maybe the most amazing thing to me. I mean, for one thing, the divine or God is really not a puppet master who's pulling all these strings. It doesn't control things on earth very much. Created them, but the divine doesn't really control things. And the divine doesn't need praise, doesn't need prayer, doesn't need devotion, doesn't need any of the stuff that we learn to do in religious training. And the other thing that's really important is that we are all God. We're one consciousness. And the divine doesn't judge us or cast us out or send us to hell or any of that, because we're all part of the divine. It would be like casting himself out. And the divine or God creates environments in which we, as part of God, get to go and learn and evolve and grow. And that God actually creates in order to grow and evolve. And that implies something else. God isn't perfect. God is continuing to grow and evolve, and we are helping God. That our divine mission, or our mission to these planets, to these lives that we live, is to learn, and everything we learn is uploaded and becomes part of now what the divine knows. So we are part of God. It's sort of like, you think of a redwood tree and think of a carbon atom in the redwood tree. Well, a carbon atom is both the tree and a carbon atom. So we are both individual souls, and also we're part of God simultaneously. And so it's a very different way of thinking of God and thinking of our relationship to God. Another metaphor Jordan uses is like, we're like bees in a hive that, that we go out from the hive to collect nectar, and the nectar we're collecting is knowledge, is learning, is experience, and most important, learning how to love. And we bring that back to the hive, to all, to collective consciousness, to the divine, and the divine learns as we learn, and that's our role. That's our work. It's very important work to go out into the world to learn, and wherever we learn, primarily through the experience of pain, by the way, whatever we learn is then part of God and part of the divine, because we're part of the divine.
So you say that we learn through pain and that there's no judgment in the afterlife. But, some people might look at that and think, well, surely bad people, when they die, they're not just given a pat on the back and everybody loves them.
No, but if you think about, the Catholic concept is we come here to learn how to try to be good. And if we're good in certain, we're good enough, we get to go through the gates and be in heaven and be in the presence of God. And if we're not good enough and we do bad things, we commit sin, then we go to the hot place, and we're punished for all eternity. And it's just not true. Everything that Jordan describes contradicts that. what happens typically when we die is that we go to a transitional place called the landing place, where we get used to not having a body. And in that transitional place, we may be bringing vestigial experiences from our just completed life. We may still be struggling with fear or anger or a sense of self that we don't like or we're uncomfortable with, a rejected sense of self. And so we may go to certain bardos where we work through some of this, because you can't bring anger, hate, fear, grief into the afterworld, into the spirit world. So in the adjacent areas to the spirit world, where souls may go through some transitional work to recover from a just completed life. But once we get into the spirit world, the very first thing that happens is we do a life review. And that's where, if you've done difficult things, painful things, or inflicted pain on others, the life review is very tough, because you have to essentially re-experience all that. And the life review is kind of unique in the sense that you're not just watching the experience, but you're experiencing it as you experience making those choices that did harm or hurt, or even were loving choices. I mean, you're watching the whole thing. It's not just the negative or painful things. You're watching your whole life. But you're not only experiencing it as you experienced it, but you're experiencing it as the other person experienced it. And not only as they experienced it at the moment when you made that choice or that behavior, but how it affected them over time. So a man that slaps his son is experiencing the slap as the choice he's making, simultaneously experiences the slap as his son experienced it. And finally, he's experiencing the slap as the son experienced it over time, how that slap affected his sense of self and his sense of who he was. And all of that is experienced with each action, with each choice that we make. So that the review is extraordinarily difficult in many cases. The more pain you've caused in your life, the more difficult and challenging the review is. So there are consequences for the choices that we've made that have inflicted pain or hurt others. But the consequence isn't punishment. It's that we have to go through a learning process to absorb what we did and how it affected and changed and damaged other conscious beings.
Do you feel the landing place is where near-death experiences occur?
Yes. Usually when people have near-death experiences, what they are describing is the landing place. And what happens typically there, Jordan has described his experience in the landing place. What typically happens there is you're presented with a scene, and it's not physical. It's actually energy that creates the images in the scene. And it's something usually that's familiar to you from your life. It might be a beautiful garden. It might be a place that you have loved and are familiar with. But it's something that induces a sense of calm and peace. And in that place, you start getting used to not having a body. You get used to moving by intention rather than using the muscle power of your legs. You get used to seeing 360 because you don't just see out of your eyes in one direction, you see in all directions. You have to get used to whatever you're thinking can show up as an image in front of you, can take an energetic form. And Jordan described, for example, trying to calm himself by using images of Yosemite. And then it occurred to him, some odd reason, elephants. And now he's seeing elephants in Yosemite. And he's starting to realize that whatever he thinks is actually creating imagery. And so we have to get used to that. that our thoughts can take form in front of us, and we have to kind of learn to cope with that. So there's a lot to kind of get used to. And then in the landing place, we are usually greeted by guides and very often by loved ones who have died before us. Although sometimes we're greeted by loved ones who are still living, because part of their soul always remains in the afterlife. So they may come to greet us as well. So familiar people, both guides and loved ones, are usually there to calm us, to create an environment of love, and to give us a sense that all is well. At that point, guides will also kind of impart to us, what's the next step here? It may be that we may need to remain in that anti-world for a little while to process, intense emotions that are left over from a life, or to cope with, uncertainty and confusion that we may have. We may not even be fully aware that we're dead, and we're struggling to understand, well, where are we? What's going on here? So we may spend a little time in these bardos, or these adjacent areas to the spirit world, where we work through whatever we might still be struggling with and carrying with us into our post-death existence. But at some point, we do move into the spirit world, but only if we are ready and willing to undergo a life review. If we're not ready and willing to do that, we remain in these adjacent places and bardos until we are ready. Sometimes people need a lot of healing. They have damaged energy from a life just lived. They may, for example, have died in war or died in a horrible abuse situation, and they need some healing before they enter the spirit world. And so there are essentially spiritual hospitals where souls, their energy is remodeled, and guides and healers help them prepare to enter the spirit world with healing work on the soul energy. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on, and when we have near-death experiences, that's the place where we're usually experiencing. We're having contact with guides, loved ones. People often describe the beautiful environments that are sort of unreally beautiful. The colors are so vibrant, so special, and so lovely. And there's this profound feeling of peace and love that permeates everything. And that's very much what we do experience when we go to the landing place.
And all of the stuff that we're experiencing, then it would be God or the divine that's experiencing this and learning from those experiences. Is that right? Or is God like an individual like we are, a consciousness that thinks and experiences? Or is it something different?
Well, God or the divine is all of consciousness, is collective consciousness. It's all of consciousness. Ours together with all other consciousness. That's the divine. But the divine has a problem. The divine and souls that are in spirit also have a problem. They're surrounded by love, and there's this intense experience of belonging, of connection, of love joining all of consciousness into one spiritual entity. So all of that is going on. But what God doesn't know how to do is how to love in the face of pain, how to generate love. And so we come here to learn how to do that. So the spirit world, love is just there. It connects all of us. We experience it, but we don't know how to generate it ourselves. So we have to come here to learn how to generate love in the face of pain, in the face of difficulty. That's why there's so much pain in the world and in our lives as incarnate beings. All of that pain it creates an opportunity for us to learn how to love when we're in pain. I mean, let me give you sort of I don't know if you think it's a silly example, but let's say A woman comes home from work and she's had a really bad day. Her boss criticized her. She's afraid she's going to lose her job, so she's anxious. She's exhausted, and she is also feeling bad about herself, like she's failing in some way. So she's feeling sad and anxious and exhausted. And her child is also having a bad day and is feeling very upset and is having trouble with their homework. So love requires her, in the face of her own pain, in the face of her anxiety, in the face of her sadness and doubts about herself, in the face of her physical exhaustion, all these sources of pain, emotional and physical pain, love is asking her to respond to the needs of her child. And that is something you can't learn how to do in the spirit world, because there is no pain in the spirit world. And so we come here to learn how to love in a physical existence in which there's so much pain, so many obstacles to love. And we learn how to generate love ourselves rather than just being the recipients of love. So it's a very powerful and important role that we have. And it's why there's so much pain here, because pain is one of the main ways we learn. And pain is not doesn't mean that you're failing, doesn't mean you've necessarily done anything wrong or bad. Pain is a large part of life. And it's how we face pain and how we learn how to love in the context of pain. That is our reason for being here.
Hi, this is Simon. Do you have a fascination with reincarnation? And would you like to know about your past lives? I have a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy, and I conduct past life regression sessions over Zoom. If you'd like to find out how a session works for you, you can book a free 20-minute consultation on my website. That's at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. The link is in the show notes. So you talk about we go to the landing place and we may need to have healing and recover from pain or emotional pain, but then we go through a process and we're reincarnated. And it seems that for some people, something comes through from the previous life, maybe some kind of pain that affects them in the next life. And is that done by design?
I don't know. I don't think so. The design is that we have amnesia. Because if we don't have amnesia and we actually knew that and we're aware of and remembered the hundreds of lives many of us have experienced and the many lessons from those lives, and we had memory of what the spirit world is like and what it's our soul group and all the elements of the spirit world. If we knew all of that, we wouldn't take this place very seriously. We wouldn't take the pain we experience here very seriously. It's kind of like, if you think about incarnation, it's like a soul group is a group of souls that tend to reincarnate together, and you can think of them as like a little repertory theater company that come and do many plays together, and they each have many different roles over these many plays. And if they go to the green room after a play and they can remember every play they've ever had, they've ever performed in, it doesn't mean that much. And they don't take the play very seriously. But if while we're in the play, we don't remember any of the other plays, any of the other lives, or what the spirit world is like, we're going to take everything that happens in that life very seriously. It's going to mean a lot. And we're going to respond as if it's all as if this is the only life and the only experience we have. And so the amnesia is really important for the lesson plans that we arrive in each life to learn. And so so now, but your question is, what happens when there's bleed through? And there is. And one of the things that seems to bleed through is if you had a traumatic death in a previous life, in the most recently lived life, that sometimes bleeds through in the form of a phobia and a fear in this life. In fact, Michael Newton, who wrote the book Journey of Souls and discovered the process for doing a life between life regressions, he learned about it because he was working with a client who had this phobia that didn't seem to remit, and he wasn't getting much progress with it. And he wanted to see if the phobia related to and was bleeding through from a past life. So he did a past life regression and then went to her death in that life, and then was surprised to find that instead of focusing on her death in that life, she had popped into the life between lives. And so that form of hypnosis was born, and he discovered it that way. But he discovered it because he knew that sometimes traumatic experiences in previous lives do bleed through to our current life in the form of fear, usually. And why that happens, it may be just that the intensity of the experience is still somewhat imprinted on the soul. And so there's still some remnant of that experience that gets reignited in the new life. So I don't know for sure how that all happens and why it happens, but it's certainly true. I've had clients who have had fears that, when we did a past life regression, clearly related to events in the past life, even though they couldn't remember what those events were. So yes, there is sometimes bleed through, but primarily our experience is amnesia, because we wouldn't take this life seriously, and the lessons in this life would not be learned if we didn't take the life seriously. I mean, think of the things that we lose, the people that we lose, and if we didn't have the experience of loss, some incredibly important lessons would not be learned. If we said, "Oh yeah, well, whatever. I mean, I'll see that person soon. It's all good. I'll see him in the green room." The lessons would be missed. So that's why the amnesia is an important part of each soul's experience when they incarnate.
I think in the book you mention young souls, and this can be a little confusing because I get the impression that the afterlife doesn't have time. There's no past or future in the afterlife. So how can you have a young soul? Aren't they all created at the same moment?
No. Souls are continuing to be created even as we speak. And they're not all created at the same moment at all. But souls have, a young soul is a soul that hasn't incarnated very many times, and is often still in an early learning process of how to manage a physical body. One of the ways you can tell young souls often is that they are not very good at managing the emotions or the drives and desires that bodies have. We live in, this particular incarnation on Earth is known in the spirit world as a very difficult place to come, because the bodies that we inhabit are very unruly. They are often strongly driven by emotional states, by the limbic system in our brain. And they are driven by needs and desires that are so powerful that young souls often have great difficulty managing them. And so we often see young souls just, struggling to control their needs and desires and emotions. They don't know what to do with them. And it may take them a number of lifetimes to really begin to recognize, well, what do I do with this when I'm living in this body? What do I do with it? And of course, some bodies are more difficult than others. Some bodies are more driven by emotion and desire than others. So we have a real learning curve in terms of just inhabiting these physical beings and figuring out how to make choices not entirely driven by our bodies and our egos.
And is it the younger souls that tend to be more angry and destructive and get violent?
Yeah. And it's also younger souls that tend to be more tribal in their orientations. You know, tribal meaning like we're good and you're bad, so, we're good and these people who are not in our tribe are bad and we can do anything to them. They're not us. They're not even human necessarily. And it's true that many tribes, the word for the tribe is human and everybody else is sort of not quite human. And you can do anything to them. You can kill them, enslave them, steal their possessions and so forth. Because they're not human. And tribal thinking is something that young souls tend to do. And they don't see how we're all joined, how we're all connected, how we're all essentially one. And that learning, takes place, over, lifetimes, learning how to love. Tribalism kind of gets in the way of learning how to love because you're only able to love who's in your tribe, who's adjacent to you. You're not able to love people who are outside of the tribe because they're not people. And so and warfare is really driven by tribalism. And so I think it's not, I may not be going too far to say that people that are drawn to and engage in and support warfare and have that sort of tribal mentality of us against them may often be fairly young souls and are still, early in their learning process.
And I suppose religion can be tribal as well, can't it?
Absolutely the case. That's one of the problems. I mean, religion both, kind of can teach us about and give us a cosmology for understanding our connection to spirit and things outside of our individual selves, so that it can give us access to that. But it also often will provide us tribe and tribal thinking, where my religion is the way, the truth, and the light, and the one true religion, and everything else is wrong and bad. And so we have crusades, where a religion goes after a group of people with a different religion, deciding that they're not okay and there's something bad about them. And so that kind of tribal thinking, often results in in Europe, the 100 Years' War, essentially is one religion against another. I mean, so that tribal thinking is certainly one of the drawbacks of religion, and also the judgmental thinking. Even the thought that things are good or bad is problematic, because things are not good or bad. It's just we're learning. We're just learning. And sometimes we do things that cause incredible pain. And instead of thinking of them as bad, thinking of them as we haven't learned something important here. And when we do a life review and see the consequence and the outcome of that choice and how that pain was experienced by others, well, that's when important learning takes place. So it's not that any particular behavior or choice is a good or bad thing. It's that each of these choices provides us an opportunity to learn, even when the choice involves doing something, or maybe even especially when the choice involves doing something that hurts others.
And so we might be able to spot old souls because they're more kind of sympathetic. It's like they've lived lives in all these different tribes. They've been a white person, a black person, they've been gay, they've been straight, they've been male, they've been female, they've been young, they've been poor. So they've learned all that stuff. So now when they incarnate, they're more accepting?
Yes. I think that's exactly, I appreciate you saying this, Simon, because I think that's exactly right. The more often we incarnate, and we usually incarnate in very different situations, very different circumstances, in different kinds of bodies. I've certainly incarnated as a female, as well as a male, and I've incarnated in, various very difficult situations and in, the so-called minority groups and so forth. I've one of my last incarnation, I was gay, and I think we hold on to some vestigial knowledge from those incarnations. We don't remember the incarnation itself. I mean, I got to know about it because I did a hypnotic regression, but we don't usually remember the incarnation itself and the details of who we were and our identity in that life. But we retain some sense of what it means to be different and have gone through different kinds of pain and different kinds of identities. And so I think you're right about that. But it takes a lot of incarnations to actually have that sense of, oh my God, I've had all, there's all these apparent differences between souls in these bodies, but there's something fundamentally the same as well. We're all united in some way. We're all connected in some way. And that knowledge often comes and evolves slowly, I think, for us.
Does Jordan ever mention lives on other planets? Because it seems like Earth is such an average planet on the edge of a galaxy, and there's so many other worlds. We almost look at ourselves as being too important, that think everything happens here.
Well, there are souls incarnating in, and I have no idea the number of physical planets. There are also other dimensions that are not even entirely physical dimensions where souls incarnate. But there are countless other planets where souls incarnate. And they often, we tend to return to the same planet over and over and over again because it's familiar. Also, when we incarnate, we tend to incarnate, we can incarnate at any point in that planet's time, but or at least in the time on that planet that animals existed that had a certain amount of awareness and choice and so forth, so on. So I mean, obviously, not every animal on every planet that can sustain life is suitable for souls to inhabit. So I mean, obviously, that's there are planets that are primarily water planets that souls inhabit animals that live in water. There are other planets that have a very different, the animals have very different biochemistry that souls inhabit. And so, yes, there are many planets and many species that souls will incarnate into members of that species. So this particular planet is a more difficult one. Human bodies are more difficult for reasons I've said a little bit about already. And yet we do tend to incarnate to the same planet over and over again until that planet goes away in some way, no longer is habitable. Now, souls sometimes move from one planet to another so that their planet is no longer habitable. So they now move and start inhabiting another planet. And those souls often have very difficult transitional lives as they're getting used to this new body, this new animal that they're living inside of, and this new planet and this new environment. So those souls often go through some really tough times in early in early lives on the new planet. The other thing I was starting to say is we tend to go to the same planet and also the same time frame. So, my most immediate past life was being a gay academic in St. Louis in the 30s, and I died sometime in the early 40s. I was murdered in that life, my next life really starts only maybe 6-8 years after my death in the previous life. So I'm staying in the same time frame because souls like to, they actually don't like things to change that much, So I came back to a time where there were still cars, still airplanes, still, so that the environment wasn't so terribly different than the last life I had lived. There's still trains and so forth. There's so many elements of the environment were very similar, and souls tend to do that. So they actually end up moving through time, and so even though they could go from a life in the 40s to a life 6 centuries from now, assuming that there's still life on this planet 6 centuries from now, or they could go back to early Stone Age periods where there were still souls incarnating in human bodies, in human form. So you could, in theory, move radically through time and enter any time that human life existed on this planet. But souls tend to actually follow a time stream because they like the familiarity. So yeah, there's now you said something I thought was really important about, well, is there time in the afterlife? And the answer is yes, but it's different than the time we experience here. In the afterlife, we can watch the entire history of the universe, from the Big Bang to the last moment of the universe's existence. We can see the whole thing, and we can see the whole history of a planet. We can see the whole history of a species on that planet, and we can watch all of that from the afterlife. But it's also true that time exists in the afterlife in a peculiar way. There was the time we didn't know something, and then there was the time we did know something. So everything we're learning creates a timeline in the afterlife. There was a time we didn't know how to do X, and then there was a time we did know how to do X. There was a time when that mother didn't know how to put her pain aside, her tiredness, her anxiety, her sadness aside, to be able to take care of her child. But there was a time that she did learn how to do that. So there's time in the afterlife is a measurement of learning. It's a measurement of learning, and souls do learn, and there's a vector of learning that occurs. So there was a time when a soul didn't know how to do something, and there's a time that it did, and that is measured by some kind of time sense. Even though from the afterlife we can watch the entire timeline of the universe, still we are learning. And as our consciousness grows and learns, as the consciousness of the divine grows and learns, there's a timeline. There was a time when the consciousness of the divine didn't know something, and there's a time when it did know something. And that time literally is how we measure change. And I don't know if that's making sense or not, but it's how Jordan has given me to understand the difference between time here in a physical universe and time in the spirit world.
If in the spirit world you can see all of history, and you were talking about being incarnated in like the 1920s, 1930s, and then being incarnated again a few years after that death, but could you say, I want to live in that 20th century again, and then just have another life that overlaps with both of those?
Yes. And I think that happens fairly often, where the same soul is in two different bodies, usually in very different places, so that they're not going to be interacting with each other. But my understanding is that can happen.
So the book we were kind of talking about is called Lessons from the Afterlife. Could you tell us about your other books again and where people can get them?
Yeah. Well, Seeking Jordan was the first book. It was just a story of finding him and learning about his experience in the afterlife, his particular experience, what it's been like for him. And and that is going back in print next year. It's been out of print for a while, but it's going back into print next year. The next book that came out was Luminous Landscape of the Afterlife, and that was really, again, and that's still available in all the places books are sold. And it describes the spirit world in a lot of detail, and what to expect when you die. It's really about preparing for death. What are you going to experience when you die? What is that place, that spirit world, and also how to prepare for the transition. So it's really it's kind of in the tradition of books of the dead, the books that prepare us for death, and tell us what we're going to find there. So that's the Luminous Landscape. Then the Love in the Time of Impermanence is looking at how to bring love into our lives in each incarnation on Earth in particular. So it's all about how do you create love in the face of pain? Really, that's what we were talking about earlier. And finally, the Lessons from the Afterlife is really talks a lot about what is this physical place, this planet, and what is it? What is this place? How is it created? How did it get here? What is its purpose, and why are we here? So that book is really looking at the nature of the physical universe, why it exists, and why we enter it.
Do you have a website?
Well, seekingjordan.com is a website where you can learn. There's more of Jordan's writings there, and so if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about him and what he's written about lots of different topics, you can find it in seekingjordan.com.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for being on the podcast.
Appreciate it greatly, Simon. Really enjoyed our conversation.
So this week I was talking to Matt McKay about his book, Lessons from the Afterlife. And a great way to support the podcast is to join Patreon. When you subscribe for $6 a month, you get exclusive access to an extended episode every week. For $3 a month, you can get access to an extended episode every month. And you can now sign up for a 7-day free trial. The Patreon episodes are ad-free and are released 2 days before the free versions. You can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Our Paranormal Afterlife, or click on the Patreon button on my homepage at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. The links are in the show notes. And look out for the Our Paranormal Afterlife episodes called Paranormal Stories that are released every Tuesday. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via your favourite podcast app. Make sure that you don't miss out on any episodes. And thanks for listening.